Over the weekend, a federal appeals court blocked the deployment of the National Guard in Chicago. However, the court also said the troops can temporarily remain under federal control.
Mother arrested by ICE in front of a Chicago elementary school. This was near the UIC campus on the west side. Several officers, some of them wearing face coverings, forcefully removed her from her car.
Despite legal pushback, the Trump administration is moving full speed ahead with its effort to deploy National Guard troops to Democrat-led cities across the United States. We've seen this in Washington, D.C., Memphis, Portland, and there's an effort to bring them into Chicago, although a federal judge has stalled that, but did allow them on the ground in Illinois. Now, the Trump administration argues that these troops are there to protect ICE agents and federal property amid its mass deportation effort, while also cracking down on lawlessness and crime. Now, local leaders say they have a handle on what's going on in their cities and that this effort is unwarranted, unconstitutional, and a threat to civil liberties. But before we unpack all of that, if you like this kind of content, don't forget to hit subscribe. Joining me today to break all of this down is ACLU of Illinois Communications Director Ed Yohnka. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
We've seen footage of National Guard troops on the ground in those cities that I mentioned, and we've seen chilling footage of ICE agents pulling people out of their cars and their homes to make these arrests. But I can imagine that there's a lot that we are not seeing. Can you tell me what's going on in your area and what people are telling you?
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing is exactly as you describe it, which is that we're seeing these instances of just abject cruelty and excessive use of force by ICE agents, often masked, heavily armed ICE agents in the Chicago area, breaking people's car windows, bursting into stores, pulling people off the street. There was a video recently of a young woman who screams out, "I'm only 15 years old," who is hauled up in the air and thrown to the ground by someone, who appears to be twice her size. We've seen, sort of violent attacks on protesters and journalists around the Broadview detention center. So we're seeing all of these things play out. I think the thing that this doesn't necessarily show is, first of all, the sort of the fear that is instilled in people as the result of these activities. People who are afraid to take their kids to school, people who are afraid to, go to work, people who are afraid to leave their house, people who are afraid to, go to a store in their neighborhood, go to the grocery store, go to a business, go to a restaurant, just simply have a night out with their family. All of these are things that I think are real in many parts of the city and parts of the Chicagoland. To be clear, it's not just the city of Chicago. At the same time, I think what we're seeing across all of those areas as well is a real sense of resolve, as you have likely seen whenever ICE is present in a community. People just turn out and show up and call for them to leave. Instantaneous protests popping up, demanding an end to these practices, trying to protect the people who are around them. And I think that this is the kind of, resolve that we're seeing across the city and across the area is really reflective of the fact that people just don't want this kind of violence being brought to their communities by their own federal government using their tax dollars.
Oh, you're right. And as you said, the fear is palpable and the resolve is we're seeing that even more because, and one of the reasons why I think we're seeing that amongst the public is that when the administration first announced that they were going to do these mass deportations, they told the American public that they were going to go after the violent criminals, the worst of the worst. But that's not what we're seeing, and that's not what's being reported.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something that is really become clear as these raids have taken on this increasingly escalated violent posture, which is that people are looking and saying, but wait a second, they're doing this, but the person they're taking is a dad with a family who has no criminal record. We were treated to the spectacle of ICE agents, masked and in this camouflage marching up and down Michigan Avenue, and they pulled a family out of Millennium Park because the daughter had just wanted to go and visit the Bean. We see in many communities these agents sort of, throwing people to on the concrete, twisting their arms behind, hog tying them using zip lines. And then it turns out that it's somebody who didn't even have a parking ticket. And as I often say, who among us has not had a parking ticket? So these are actions that we're seeing by the administration that really, don't in any way, shape, or form make us safer, and are not doing anything, to make us more safe as a community, or doing something to rid our country of people who aren't committed to the country. Instead, what's often happening is, we're seeing an attack on people who are simply family members, and disrupting the vibrant life of communities that is exactly why people live in these neighborhoods, is because of, the vibrancy that people bring, the way in which they engage with the community and care about their families and other people's families. All of that is being undermined by these activities by ICE.
And we're seeing the administration pump a lot of these videos out of the raids and the arrests, and they're wanting people to believe something that a lot of people on the ground are saying, that we're seeing it with our own eyes, what's really happening. And it's interesting because a federal judge had said amidst the legal battle about what's going on with this, that the administration lacked credibility in its argument. And now the judge did allow the troops in Illinois, but not going into Chicago. Can you explain what the judge meant by that, by saying that the administration lacked credibility in their argument?
Yeah, I think, to build off of our last discussion, I think one of the things we're seeing here is there are two groups of people who aren't buying the administration's arguments: the public on the ground and judges on the bench. Last week in Chicago, 3 different federal court judges questioned the administration's veracity and their ability to justify the actions that they're taking around a warrantless arrests by ICE, and saying that the judge saying that they just didn't find credibility on the part of the administration when they said they hadn't broken a prior agreement not to make warrantless arrests. A judge who said that when the administration said it was only using the force necessary to protect ICE agents, for protesters and journalists who are around the Broadview ICE Center, the judge said they didn't find that credible. And in the case of, the placement of the National Guard, or the federalization of the National Guard, and they're bringing them to Illinois, what the judge said was, I don't buy your explanation as to why that's necessary. And in fact, what we hear is that the administration couldn't even pick and choose which of their arguments that they wanted to make. And I think that I say often, this is an administration which seeks to bend reality to fit whatever policy goal they want. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing here is, this issue that they simply cannot meet or cannot create a reality which matches the experience of people here in Chicago as they actually see it on the ground.
Signed an executive order creating ICE-free zones, which includes preventing agents from using city-owned property for enforcement operations, which includes, schools, libraries, parks, things of that nature. How legally strong is that order, and what happens if it's broken?
I think we are gonna. I think that's one of the things that we have yet to really know in terms of the interaction between the city government and the federal government if ICE decides to cross the line into one of those zones. I do think, and I think the mayor and the city deserve commendation for sending a signal to people that these are the kinds of areas that we want to protect by making that local policy statement that when you go to a school, when you go to church, when you go to a library, these are places we want you to be safe. And you should be there thinking about learning, worshiping, educating oneself, and not thinking about, immigration enforcement by masked ICE agents. So I think that's a positive, and I think it's something that other governments probably will look at modeling. I think in terms of the final legal test, we just don't know yet.
What about private businesses? What recourses do they have? Can they do a similar type of thing?
The private business question is a really interesting one because, of course, one of the things is that ICE or other police often have the ability to come into a public space. So if you have a business, and just to pick it out, if you own a shoe store, the general area in front where you display shoes and where people sit down and try on shoes is a public area that's open to anybody. It's hard to keep an agent or a law enforcement official of any kind out of that space. But if you have an area in the back where you store stock, where employees eat lunch, where maybe there's a locker room where they change or something of that nature, those can be designated as private areas. You can have a sign and you can demand that ICE have a warrant before they enter those spaces. Now, one of the things we see with this increasingly kind of violent and reckless sort of enforcement, we don't know that they'll always adhere to or acknowledge the request of a business owner to have that space. But that's something we see a lot of business owners in Chicago beginning to do, is to try to designate the private and public space in order to, both protect employees, but also to send a message that they are the kind of business, the kind of community that understands, the needs of their entire community and isn't going to give in to this kind of reckless enforcement.
The Trump administration has kind of toyed with considering invoking the Insurrection Act. We've heard some of them talk about that, which allows military forces to conduct law enforcement duties in the event of a national emergency. If Trump does this, what legal recourse do state and local leaders have if it gets to that point?
Well, one of the things that's important to remember, and I think we're seeing it play out in a lot of this National Guard litigation, is the Insurrection Act, while it gives broader powers to the president and to the military, actually has some requirements that have to be met in order for it to be invoked. There has to be, some sort of actual armed rebellion happening, or a foreign invasion, or there has to be an inability to actually engage in enforcement of federal law. As we're seeing, the federal government doesn't seem to be having any trouble enforcing its laws. In fact, it's doing it, with reckless abandon across the area. So, one of the things that we feel certain is that, if the administration were to, invoke the Insurrection Act and attempt to bring in forces, any type, including federalized National Guard, I think it is a certainty that, the state government and local governments would file actions to challenge those in the same way that they have the National Guard. It bears repeating. There just simply isn't any condition on the ground in Chicago that justifies the introduction of these sorts of militarized forces. Our cities, and the city of Chicago, is not, to use the president's word, a training ground, for military might. It is simply not something that we do in America, and it's one of the reasons, I think, again, this sort of, as we see, sort of quasi-military activity around ICE. It's one of the reasons that you see so many people standing up and objecting to the actions of the administration, both here in Chicago and across the country, quite frankly.
How big of a legal battle is this going to be for these state and local leaders against the federal government in terms of what's going on right now?
I think it's going to be just big enough that they're going to meet it. I think one of the things that you see, probably this shows a certain bias, if you will, about having been born and raised in Illinois and watching Chicago politics for all of my life. But, it's pretty amazing to see all of the elected officials in Chicago and the state of Illinois stand shoulder to shoulder against something or in favor of something. That is not something we're accustomed to as a state and as a local entity. Like, that is not the way it works here. Usually elected officials are in a constant fight and battle about something. As Harold Washington once observed here, politics ain't beanbag. And so I think that, one of the things that I think we have a lot of confidence in is, given that unity and given that show of support, that the attorney general and the governor and the mayor and the county board president, that other public officials are all working together in this way to really hit back and to push back against this. And, you hear from legislators' willingness to give additional funds to the attorney general because of all the different litigation and work that his office is doing. I think there is a sense of shared community spirit here that we're really seeing play out.
And what is the ACLU's message to your average citizens who are living in a state of fear right now and uncertainty, and who are scared in all of this, in this situation? What is your message to those people who don't know what's going to happen next?
Yeah, I think there are three things that we would say. Number one, remember that you still have constitutional rights in this moment. Nothing that happened as the result of Donald Trump being reelected president changed the Constitution in any way. He may think it did, but it didn't change the Constitution. So remember that you have rights. You should learn what those rights are. We have some groups here in the Chicagoland area who've done just an amazing job in immigrant and newcomer communities, training people on those rights, not starting last year, not starting earlier this year, but starting a decade ago. And it just really are heroes. Groups like the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights and the Resurrection Project and other groups of that ilk have really just done an incredible job and deserve an enormous amount of praise. I think the second thing that we would say to people, though, is recognize that some of these federal officials, as we saw in Los Angeles, don't always necessarily honor those rights. And so people should be careful and protect themselves and their families. So, I think if you think that they're doing something that is illegal against you, don't resist, obstruct, and put yourself at risk of physical harm, but record all the information you can, even if it's just remembering it, or if somebody around you can record it, so that it can be challenged later. And the last thing that I would say our message is that for all the rest of us who have the privilege of not being caught up in this or being targeted in this way, is to remember that we could be next. And so it's critical that we show up now and speak out about these things to the greatest degree that we can. It is, it may be that today the attack is on trans kids or gender affirming care or immigrants and newcomers. But the truth is that tomorrow it will be those of us who simply oppose this administration's policies in some other way. And so it is really important and critical that we are standing up for fundamental rights today so that we're able, to stand up to those tomorrow.
Ed, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a fascinating conversation, and you've given a lot of great information. And to those of you who are watching, don't forget to hit subscribe.